The theme, Whatever Happened to Religious Life, The Laity Speaks Revisited, recalls the Institute's historic 1978 National Congress in St. Louis. And that rang a bell for me. I remembered reading something about that somewhere in my research. So I checked my files and I found a report on that meeting in the newsletter of the National Coalition of American Nuns, which I thought might be interesting and even amusing for you to hear. As you may or may not know, the National Coalition of American Nuns is an organization of men and women, lay and religious, and to put it kindly, they are not supportive of church authority or church teachings. They really should change the name of that organization because it besmirches the term nun. At any rate, the National Coalition was not at all happy with the IRL meeting in St. Louis in 1978 because, of course, it supported church teaching. The coalition declared, quote, "Insulting men and women religious by a whatever conference will not diminish the undeniable reality which is 20th century religious life, not over-the-shoulder nostalgia." So that tells you what they thought of the Congress in St. Louis at the time. Then, this was the kicker, I thought, they went on to say that the lay speakers at that particular meeting were a, quote, "who's who in right-wing America." And then they went on to list the speakers, who were Phyllis Schlafly, Congressman Henry Hyde, the outstanding pro-life leader, journalist Dale Francis, who preceded me at our Sunday Visitor, Virgil Deschamps, the Supreme Knight of the Knights of Columbus, and Geraldine Frawley of Twin Circle Publishing. I'm quite sure all those speakers, as well as the IRL founders, would have been quite pleased to know that the 1978 Congress managed to incur the wrath of the National Coalition of American Sisters. So you can see why I feel honored to be among the laity who have been invited to speak at Institute gatherings. I'm among some very outstanding names, and mine being the least of them, of course. My topic, Religious Life in Crisis or at Crossroads, was chosen for me by the Institute several months ago. But it's very timely, for in the past few weeks, Pope Benedict XVI has addressed this very topic at least 3 times, even using the word crisis. Just 10 days ago, Cardinal Frank Rode also talked about a, quote, crisis situation in religious life. As you know, he's the prefect of the Vatican's Congregation for Institutes of Consecrated Life and Societies of Apostolic Life, which for the sake of brevity in this talk I'll refer to by its former name of the Congregation for Religious. The 2 men also cited, as well as crisis, also cited positive signs in religious life. And I think we could safely interpret these positive signs as giving directions for which crossroad to take. So I think I'm on solid footing to use the remarks of the Pope and Cardinal Rode as the outline for my talk today, and to conclude that religious life is both in crisis and at crossroads. Now, you may be wondering why a layperson like me got so interested in, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to warn some of you, you may be in my slide presentation. I was surfing on your websites to grab photos, and there are some various ones up here you might see yourselves, so I hope no one will get me for copyright infringement. You might be wondering why a layperson like me got so interested in religious life. And when I've addressed audiences less friendly than yourselves, I've been accused of being presumptuous to dare to tell religious men and women anything about religious life. In fact, at one panel discussion at the History of Women Religious Conference, I was told to stop talking and sit down before my time was up. I felt like the messenger who was shot because the message was unacceptable. But I'm confident that this audience will be much more receptive of my message today. And if you're not, I'm sure Father Nelson will tell me to sit down and be quiet. So let me start with a couple of disclaimers. I've never been a member of a religious order, though I do admit to being envious of 6 of my high school classmates who entered religious life when we graduated from high school. I was envious because they felt a special calling to religious life, and I didn't experience that calling. Still, I've had a lifelong admiration for religious who were my teachers from kindergarten through college, who were my employers for the years that I was a teacher, and many of whom have been my friends throughout my life. Secondly, I don't claim to be an expert in all matters of religious life. I merely claim some insights derived from 16 years of researching and writing about religious life. And I hope some of those insights I've gained as an outsider looking in will be helpful to you. And I hope you'll forgive me if I make any mistakes on this topic. I'll just argue that, hey, I'm a layperson and I don't know everything. When Benedict addressed the leaders of the International Union of Superiors General last month, he noted quote, many clouds gathering on the horizon of religious life. And he talked about orders with a long tradition in the church being in, quote, difficult crisis due to the aging of members, a more or less accentuated fall in vocations, and sometimes a spiritual and charismatic weakness. But the Pope also talked about positive signs, quote, especially when communities have chosen to return to the origins and live in a way more in keeping with the spirit of the founder. The Pope then repeated this theme on March 1st in a message to the General Chapter of the Salesians, urging them to draw continual inspiration from their founder, Don Bosco, by studying him, loving him, imitating him, and invoking him, quote, to find new ways to make the figure of Jesus known, especially to the young. To nourish their apostolic commitment, the Pope said it was necessary for religious to overcome the dispersive effects of activism and cultivate the unity of spiritual life by acquiring a profound mysticism and a solid asceticism. Now, this really struck me because so many religious that I know stress mission over consecration. And I think the Pope was telling us that that's not the way it should be. Well, I just skipped Cardinal Rode and I can't go back, but that was he on the previous slide that slipped by you. Just last week, he said on Vatican Radio, a secularized mentality had seeped into traditional religious orders. The only cure for this crisis situation, he said, is to live the charism intensely and return to the authenticity of religious life. Quote, to flee from this worldly spirit, therefore, and put the emphasis on life in community, on fraternal life, on prayer, on poverty, on obedience, on chastity, lived in the joy of the heart and in interior liberty. It is this that we should recover, and we should live intensely. Now, I want to emphasize here that Pope Benedict and Cardinal Rode were not saying to return to a pre-Vatican II model of religious life, something that some other religious and groups like the National Coalition of American Nuns say that those of us here today want to happen. Rather, the Pope and the Cardinal, and I think most of us, want to emphasize the teachings of Vatican II. And the two men clearly were referring to this section of Perfecte Caritatis, the Council's decree on the adaptation and renewal of religious life. Quote, the adaptation and renewal of the religious life includes both the constant return to the sources of all Christian life and to the original spirit of the institutes and their adaptation to the changed conditions of our times. It redounds to the good of the Church that institutes have their own particular characteristics and work. Therefore, let their founders' spirit and special aims they set before them, as well as their sound traditions, all of which make up the patrimony of each institute, be faithfully held in honor. Unfortunately, the teachings of Vatican II and subsequent church documents on religious life often have been misinterpreted and even ignored. In this first part of my talk, let me share with you some of the research into how religious life got into crisis and how the crisis has affected religious orders and the church itself. In the second part, I'll talk about the positive signs referred to by the Pope and Cardinal Rode, and how those signs will hopefully shape religious life in the future. Before the Second Vatican Council, reform of religious institutes was badly needed, for many orders had not updated their rules, customs, or apostolates since the 19th century. During the 1950s, Pope Pius XII had talked several times about the need for religious orders to update and adapt customs of the orders that may have been appropriate in times and cultures past, but not in modern times. Quote, "Let monasteries and orders of nuns have esteem for their own special character, but they must not defend it in a narrow, inflexible spirit, and still less with a certain stubbornness which is opposed to any form of timely development, and would not lend itself to any form of adaptation, even when the common good demands it." I remember in doing my research, running across some specific examples of where orders of women religious reported on various accidents due to their religious garb they were wearing at the time. Many of them said that most of them were aware of sisters who were working in the laundry getting their long flowing sleeves caught in the mangle irons and being burned by that. Some of them wrote about long cords on habits being caught in car doors and them being dragged along. And some states refused to grant driver's licenses to sisters who wore very extended headpieces that blocked their views. So one of the things that Pius was saying to do was to update some of the dress and some of the outdated customs. However, some religious resisted change in their beloved institutes, and some were simply too busy with their apostolates to evaluate what needed to be updated. Consequently, the Second Vatican Council built on the foundation laid by Pius XII and decreed that religious institutes should adapt and renew themselves. Perfecte Caritatis said, "All institutes should share in the life of the Church, adapting as their own and implementing in accordance with their own characteristics the Church's undertakings and aims in matters biblical, liturgical, dogmatic, pastoral, ecumenical, missionary, and social." Now, it's been argued that the actual documents of Vatican II were not as clear and specific as they should have been. I don't have the expertise to argue either side of that question, but I think that most people would agree that Vatican II documents have been interpreted in widely different ways, and Bishop Morlino referred to that last night. Also, many people appeal to a very nebulous, quote, "spirit of Vatican II" that defies description. Certainly part of the problem was that reform of religious life was badly needed, as Pius XII had observed, and many religious were determined to implement reform. However, some of those religious were intent on putting their own version of reform into effect. And unfortunately, the anti-authority cultural upheavals of the 1960s influenced rejection of church authority. Church-authorized experiments in religious life quickly got out of hand and often had no preparation, premise, method, or evaluation. Radical reformers learned to use coercive political tactics to manipulate or circumvent decision-making processes in their orders, to force through their own version of renewal, changing their religious orders into entities that no longer resembled religious institutes. This upheaval caused many religious to leave their orders, some because change was too radical, and others because it was not radical enough. I also found in my research that leaders of some religious orders withheld the actual council documents from their members and instead gave members their own interpretation of the documents, an interpretation that often reflected the leaders' own wishes for reform. Likewise, some leaders withheld pertinent Vatican documents that were aimed at fully explaining how renewal was to be accomplished and giving guidance on how to get renewal back on track. This may seem unbelievable in this electronic age, but there was no internet in the 20 years after Vatican II, and many orders controlled the reading material coming into religious houses. Also, most religious had no reason to mistrust their leaders, who are required by canon law to pass along to their membership all church documents pertinent to the state of life, and to be concerned about their members' observance of them. It seems to me that the biggest mistake made by religious orders in implementing renewal was that leaders in many of the orders disregarded the admonishment of Perfecte Caritatis to faithfully hold in honor their own institute's sound traditions, characteristics, and work, and to honor their founder's spirit and special aims. Father Bernard Ransing, a Holy Cross father who was on staff of the Vatican Congregation for Religious, and whom I met when I was researching my book, put it succinctly when he told the leaders of U.S. women religious in 1965, quote, "Whatever changes are made should be made not in the end or in the essentials of religious life, but in the accidentals." Unfortunately, this advice was largely ignored, and the result was the discarding of not just outdated customs, but also the essentials. This is how Cardinal Christoph Schönborn, a Dominican, described the renewal in his order, quote, "I joined the order in 1963 when the last ecumenical council began. Crisis beset the order just after that. It was tremendous and had a dramatic effect on religious life. So many confreres left the religious life. All the monastic customs of the religious life were thrown away as if they were scrap. It was a dismantling proper, the rapid secularization of the whole religious life. It all happened in a matter of months, and no less dramatic was the change in theology. All of it was a symptom of change, of an overall distorted understanding of the church and the religious life. After my book, Sisters in Crisis, came out, I received a flood of letters from other religious who described the renewal experience in their orders. One religious brother wrote this about his experience, quote, "I saw much the same thing going on that you have described in Sisters in Crisis. Members departing in droves, vocations declining, growing secularization, and a waning interest in the spiritual life. Evasion of the truth of the situation, and yes, pathological denial of it on the part of superiors. Being a recent convert to the church, I was not able to understand what I saw in relation to its historical antecedents. Consequently, I was often confused and spent much time wondering if something was wrong with me. Your book has helped me immensely to put it all in place." And this from a woman who left religious life before taking vows. I entered in 1966 and went through a traditional formation for postulants, a traditional formation that was in need of Vatican II reforms. Before beginning her canonical year, she was given permission to finish her doctorate. Upon returning to the community 2 years later, she reported this experience. "The sky had fallen, and the world had changed during my hiatus from the formation program. Now, where there had been order, howbeit too much order, there was now chaos. Where there had been obedience, observed if not blind, there was ordered rebellion." Of course, the renewal experience differed from religious order to religious order, but my research found that much of the renewal in religious communities was do-it-yourself, often based more on the convictions of reformers than on the church documents. This deconstruction was not always intentional, but sometimes just happened. As religious began to take up an interest in individual ministries, they began to live away from their communities, focusing more on the mission aspect of their lives, nearly to the exclusion of the consecration aspect. The new emphasis on individual ministries also made it more difficult for orders to staff their institutions, and orders had to withdraw from many of the educational, social service, and healthcare facilities they traditionally had operated, forcing many of them to close. This actually is my old high school, Loretto Academy in Kansas City, Missouri, and it indeed is closed. I don't want any of you young religious laughing at my school uniforms either. We really did wear saddle shoes and long navy blue skirts. Now, I don't mean to concentrate on what religious do, because John Paul made it clear in Vita Consecrata that the persona of religious as consecrated persons is more important than their work. However, this deconstruction of religious orders had a tremendous impact on the institutions within the church that were operated by religious. I put this slide in at the last minute, so I have to apologize to brothers and priests that I did not include the men, but I had the data on the women at hand, so that's what I used. This slide helps to illustrate the impact on Catholic grade and high schools and hospitals between 1965 and 1995 as the numbers of sisters declined and they withdrew from the institutions they traditionally had staffed. Of course, many Catholic schools and hospitals closed for complex reasons over and above the withdrawal of religious, but this was arguably a big factor. Note that the number of Catholics continued to rise over those 30 years, up 14.5 million, but the institutions that educated their children and cared for their sick declined. Schools by 4,886, hospitals by 203. Note also the population of sisters declined by 87,800. This withdrawal of religious from Catholic institutions not only diluted the corporate witness of religious orders, it also made religious less visible, which in turn had a negative impact on vocations as religious began to look, work, and live like laity. These changes sometimes were so gradual that many orders seemed unaware that they had lost their identity as religious institutes and were functioning more as secular institutes or even secular businesses. The fact is, today many religious orders have no corporate apostolate. The only members who live in community and relate regularly to one another are the retirees. And many orders live by mission statements that are so broad they could define any group of people, another reason that they are not attracting new members. For example, here is a mission statement from the website of the Sisters of St. Joseph of LaGrange, Illinois. Quote, "Rooted in God and our mission of unity, we desire to move toward greater inclusivity that reflects the interconnectedness of all creation, reverences diverse cultures and religions, and directs our choices in ministry, community living, and corporate decisions." And this from the mission and work page of the Loretto community, who were known as the Sisters of Loretto at the foot of the cross when they were my grade and high school teachers. Quote, "Affirming and respecting the gift of each member and our resources, we will be responsible stewards, accepting and using our resources with reverence for the good of creation, simplify our lives, collaborating with others to use fewer of Earth's resources, and sharing what we have with those who have less." These statements reflect trends against many religious orders to try to remake religious life. In fact, the founding of the Institute on Religious Life in 1974 can be traced back to concern over these trends by some hierarchy, religious, and laity. The Institute on Religious Life also provided a much-needed forum for religious superiors who were uncomfortable with the direction of the leadership conferences of women and men religious during the 1970s. An insight into the philosophy of religious life that has been promoted by some of those leaders was illustrated by a list of 10 so-called transformative elements for religious life in the future. This list was developed at the 1989 Joint Assembly of the Conference of Major Superiors of Major Superiors of Men and Leadership Conference of Women Religious, and it was republished in 1995. The 10 elements try to envision what religious life would look like in 2010, which may have seemed a long way away back in 1989, but it's only 2 years away now. Here's the first of these elements. Quote, being converted by the example of Jesus and the values of the gospel, religious in the year 2010 will serve a prophetic role in church and society. Living this prophetic witness will include critiquing societal and ecclesial values and structures, something Bishop Morlino discussed last night, calling for systemic change and being converted by the marginalized with whom we serve. Note the sociological emphasis and the buzzwords of prophetic witness, systemic change, and critiquing ecclesial values and structures. Far more troubling is element number 8, which describes an ideal vision of religious communities in 2010. Clearly, this is not how the church sees religious life, and canonical norms for consecrated life are entirely discarded in this model. Quote, in 2010, religious communities will be characterized by inclusivity and intentionality. Those communities may include persons of different ages, genders, cultures, races, and sexual orientation. They may include persons who are lay or cleric, married or single, as well as vowed and or unvowed members. They will have a core group and persons with temporary and permanent commitments. In other words, everybody is welcome. Who is it, Bob Barker used to say, everybody come on down? These communities will be ecumenical, possibly interfaith. Faith sharing will be constitutive of the value of life in this context of expanded membership. Such inclusivity will necessitate a new understanding of membership, yes, and a language to accompany it. Here's the best part. Religious life still includes religious congregations of permanently vowed members. So I'm sure all of you who are vowed religious will be relieved to know that there will still be a place for you in religious life in 2010. Seriously, this is what I mean by religious trying to remake religious orders into some other entities. And it is already being accomplished in many orders where the lines between vowed members and associate members are so compromised that associate members are often given authority over vowed members and involved in decision-making that canon law reserves to vowed members only. Clearly, church officials were concerned about such developments in religious life. It did make several efforts to get the renewal back on track. However, those efforts were either ignored or dismissed by many religious who belittled them as an effort to undo the reforms of Vatican II. As Bishop Morlino said last night, pre-Vatican II became an insult of the highest order. In June of 1971, Paul VI issued the apostolic exhortation Evangelica Testificatio, giving his observations about the renewal, which he said was marked by, quote, a mentality excessively preoccupied with hastily conforming to the profound changes which disturb our times. Paul also reminded religious of the necessity and dignity of work and the importance of silence, the religious habit, communal sharing, obedience, and faithfulness to prayer. And he stressed the centrality of the liturgy and the primacy of the interior life. Rather than embracing the Pope's message, many religious ridiculed it. Sister Sandra Snyder spoke for some when she wrote that Evangelica Testificatio was, quote, in general, a theological step backward toward pre-conciliar understandings of religious life, unquote. And Brother Gabriel Moran wrote, quote, I can hardly imagine anyone's life being influenced by those words. In 1983, the Church tried again when Pope John Paul II directed the Congregation for Religious to issue a summary of canonical norms for religious life. Essential elements in the Church's teaching on religious life as applied to institutes dedicated to works of the apostolate simply restated and clarified Church teaching and canon law on religious life. Like Evangelica Testificatio, it stressed the importance of community living and prayer, obedience to superiors and the Pope, working in a common apostolate, wearing religious garb, and placing authority in a superior, not a group. You will be interested to know that in my research I found a 1983 open letter affirming essential elements from the Institute on Religious Life and signed by 126 religious superiors affiliated with the Institute. So good work, Institute. However, other religious weren't so enthusiastic about the document. Sister Dorothy Vidulik reflected the reaction of many other religious, saying, quote, "It is a feeble recall to a lukewarm monastic style, completely divorced from Vatican II theology. Its critique by so many United States women and men religious is a healthy and encouraging sign that our lived experience is basic to the emerging new theology of religious life." Sister Patricia Whitberg revealed that her leadership did not even bother to give their sisters essential elements or Evangelica Testificatio because, quote, "To do so would have irrevocably split the community. A substantial portion of the sisters, by 1983 the majority of them, would have refused to follow the recommendations of these documents." These statements by women and men religious tell the story of how the crisis impacted numerous members of religious communities. Many of them simply rejected the authority of the Pope and the Church, convinced that their own insights were superior. This phenomenon was explained last night by Father Mulady and Bishop Morlino in a much more scholarly way than I'm approaching it, but I think we're on the same page. This fact was publicly highlighted when in 1984, the New York Times, an ad was sponsored in the New York Times by Catholics for a Free Choice, claiming that Catholics could support abortion, and it was signed by 26 religious sisters, 2 religious brothers, and 2 religious priests. Yet when Pope John Paul asked the bishops of the United States in the 1980s to undertake a study to see what was ailing religious life in this country, a commission headed by Archbishop John Quinn reached the remarkable conclusion, quote, "In general, religious life in the United States is in good condition." I met Father Tom Dubé here at the Institute on Religious Life when I was researching my book. And I asked him about the Quinn Commission, and he was quite delighted to share with me his experience about it. He was giving retreats to a lot of orders of sisters at the time, and he said that they reported to him, and he also found in his order, that when the Quinn Commission was interviewing members of the orders, the superiors told the members to only talk about the positive things that had happened since Vatican II, because we don't want to be negative. So Father Dubé said, no wonder they came up with a glowing report. We were all told not to say anything that was at all negative about what had happened in our orders. This positive conclusion by the Quinn Commission was not the conclusion reached by a study of religious life called The Future of Religious Orders of the United States. That was a 3-year study conducted by 2 psychologists, I believe from the Chicago area now, Father David Nygren and Sister Miriam Eucharitis. They analyzed data from 816 religious orders that had a total of 121,000 members, and they published the results in 1992. And here were some of their conclusions. Individualism and self-preoccupation have replaced the virtue of generosity in some religious and have affected the concept of obedience. There's a lowered respect on the part of religious for authority within their congregations, in their congregations, the church, magisterium, and the hierarchy. Many religious institutes have no sense of corporate identity and no specific mission focus, resulting in few new vocations and little inspiration for current members. A significant percentage of religious don't understand their roles in the church, with women religious, over 30%, being the most uncertain. My research did find that men religious tended to remain a little bit more stable. Mainly, it was my conclusion, because so many of them had the priesthood to ground them. Religious expressed disagreement and confusion about how the consecrated life differs from that of laity. And many religious do not seem to realize how laicized they have become and how inaccessible they are to the people who need them the most. A similar note was sounded in the 1994 document Fraternal Life and Community, issued by the Congregation for Religious. That document also said that authority was misunderstood in some orders to the point that no one was in charge, and that a culture of individualism had weakened commitment to community life and projects. In his 1996 apostolic exhortation, Vita Consecrata, Pope John Paul noted similar problems in religious life, but also stressed that consecrated life is at the heart of the church and is a manifestation of every Christian's calling to be united with Christ. Quote, Jesus himself, by calling some men and women to abandon everything in order to follow him, established this type of life, which, under the guidance of the Spirit, would gradually develop down the centuries into the various forms of consecrated life. But the Pope cautioned, what must be avoided at all costs is the actual breakdown of the consecrated life, a collapse which is not measured by a decrease in numbers, but a failure to cling steadfastly to the Lord and to personal vocation and mission. Now, on that note, let's move to the positive signs for religious life that illuminate the crossroads and may be able to alleviate, if not eliminate, the crisis. In his remarks to the Superiors General last month, Pope Benedict cited what he said were signs of a, quote, providential reawakening, which gives rise to comforting hope. First, he noted the many young people today are interested in entering religious life, as well as new forms of consecrated life. Quote, today, as in every age, there is no lack of generous souls, ready to give up everyone and everything to embrace Christ and his gospel, dedicating to his service their existence in communities characterized by enthusiasm, generosity, and joy. And indeed, it's gratifying to see so many of these young religious here today, particularly for us laity. Note that the Pope said young people were joining communities characterized by, quote, enthusiasm, generosity, and joy. This is a theme also sounded by Cardinal Rodet in his Vatican radio interview. He said people experience, quote, great admiration and joy when you encounter young monks, young Carmelite or Dominican fathers, Benedictine religious, and you see them full of joy, transparent with a great interior liberty. They are visibly in their place where God wants them, and they live their vocation in the joy and peace of the heart. I think this is the first testimony that these religious give, and it is very convincing, very believable testimony. As the philosopher Bergson said in other times, their existence is an invitation. They have no need for words. Thus, it's easy to see why young people are not attracted to religious orders that have not followed church guidelines for renewal and do not accept church authority. Pope Benedict also made this point that the young are only ready to listen and follow someone who witnesses consistently to his or her own attachment to Christ. And he noted that the orders that have preserved a tenor of life that is often very austere and faithful to the gospel often abound in vocations. Indeed, and Tim referred to this morning, the 2008 Second Annual Survey on Trends in Religious Vocation, sponsored by Vision Vocation Guide and posted on the Internet, reported that among the people discerning a vocation to religious life, 90% ranked living a life of faithfulness to the church and its teachings as either very important or essential. Other aspects considered very important or essential were devotional prayer and praying in community, 73%, and living in community, 67%. Vocation directors, both women and men, also noted an increased interest among inquirers in wearing a habit or traditional religious garb. Note that all these aspects valued by the young people were contained in the 1983 Essential Elements document that was rejected by many mainstream religious. In addition to the positive signs of the young people's interest in consecrated life and the religious orders that are living religious life faithfully, Pope Benedict identified another positive sign as new forms of consecrated life that reflect the needs of the time. He said that these new entities, quote, share in evangelical poverty practiced radically, faithful love for the church, generous dedication to our neighbor in need, with special attention for those forms of spiritual poverty that are a marked feature of our contemporary epoch. To give some idea of what's happening in the United States in this arena, here's a chart from a study by the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate at Georgetown University. It was part of a study of emerging religious communities of consecrated life or lay movements in the United States and published in 2006. Incidentally, that publication highlights 165 of those emerging communities, and so those of you who are interested in that might order it from the Carey Center. There probably are a few more communities that were not identified by Carey, and indeed I spoke to members of an emerging community this morning who said they did not participate in this study. So we know there are more of them out there. But this gives a good idea of the trends. Most of the communities studied are emerging communities that intend to follow traditional models of religious life. 2 communities identify themselves as a secular institute, and 4 more are seeking that status. Note that the chart includes associations of the faithful, which for some groups is a stage before becoming a religious institute, but for other groups it may be a permanent canonical status. This first chart shows the communities that have attained canonical status and gives the average year of their founding. It's a little confusing because some communities didn't answer this question, and it shows up there as 30% not answering, so that skews the numbers a bit, but it still gives a good idea about the emerging communities. The second chart shows communities seeking canonical status. Some of the new communities have not yet determined the type of community they hope to become or what ultimate status they will seek within the church. So it's good to know that they're out there and they're growing. Also of interest from the Carey study is a listing by the emerging communities of common themes in describing their charism, mission, or purpose. You can see that in the top tier are devotion to Mary, a simple lifestyle, fidelity to the Pope, and the Eucharist. Now that does not mean they necessarily are emphasizing one over the other, but they were interested enough in all of these aspects that they mentioned them in the survey. Father Benedict Groeschel, himself the founder of a new community, recently had a fascinating essay on religious life published in First Things. It was in the June-July 2007 issue. In case you didn't see it, try to look it up. It definitely was worthwhile. Did he talk about it yesterday at all? No. Well, in that essay he wrote that, quote, "New communities can be built on foundations of older ones by taking rejected traditions and bringing them back to life. It also means that a return to the ideals of an order's founder and embracing the charism that had been granted through that founder, rather than dubious late 20th century interpretations, can prove the difference between survival and extinction." And he gave Mother Teresa's Missionaries of Charity as one example of a thriving new community that is both original and traditional. Father Groeschel also had some advice for new communities not to make the same mistake as many older ones. Quote, "They must teach and encourage people to think for themselves without being disobedient." I know I've talked to several religious today, perhaps so that they could inform me a little better. After Bishop Marlino's comments last night about obedience, in which he stressed obedience so much, I got to thinking after I went back to my room that was fine if your superior was Ignatius or some of the other wonderful superiors in religious life. But I do think that one of the problems with the renewal was that some of the leaders were not thinking with the church, and that some of the membership were so intent on being obedient that a lot of the orders got off track because of this kind of obedience. And I think that that's what Father Groeschel is getting at when he says, think for yourselves without being disobedient. He goes on and says they must try to discuss and find a consensus within the community concerning what they do. Otherwise, there will be a return of the widespread resentment that characterized religious both on the eve of Vatican II and later when changes were forced on them. There must be an authentic and prayerful return to and respect for the following of the gospel. And finally, he said, the anthropological signs of religious life must be maintained. Note that these are also the signs that were talked about in Essential Elements and in Evangelica Testificatio. Common life, frugality, identifiable uniform dress of a religious nature, and a common apostolic work shared by all members of the community are things one must look for. Otherwise, there is, he says, no hope of a community's revival. Of course, not to be forgotten are the established orders. Father Groeschel also observed that older communities that never lost their identity are thriving because they are the communities that attract new vocations. But, he added, some young women and men are interested in authentic life, surprise us by their willingness to join religious orders that exhibit theological confusion and little observance of their traditional rule. He's optimistic that these young people may help rescue and revive such orders. And he observed, I thought with some wit, quote, in some communities there is an absurd phenomenon similar to a theological sandwich. The youngest and the oldest who are in agreement are like slices of bread. The age group in the middle reminds us of mayonnaise. If you are like me, when you think of mayonnaise, you think of squishy. In addressing the Superiors General last month, Pope Benedict acknowledged these orders that have carefully renewed and noticed that they are the orders that are receiving the bulk of vocations today. And he said that while many established orders were in crisis, which he said, quote, in certain cases has even become alarming, he also said that, quote, signs of a positive recovery can be recorded, especially when communities have the courage to return to their origins to live more in harmony with the Founder's spirit. Rediscovering the spirit of the origins, deepening knowledge of the Founder or Foundress, has helped to impress upon institutes a promising new aesthetic, apostolic, and missionary impetus. There are long-established works and activities that have thus been revived with new nourishment. There are new initiatives of an authentic actualization of the Founder's charism. It is necessary to continue on this path, he says, praying to the Lord that he will bring to fruition the work he has begun. If I may be permitted, I would like to add a couple of other categories to Pope Benedict's and Cardinal Roday's positive signs. And first would be the category of women and men religious who continue to live lives faithful to the Church and to their vows within communities that are not supportive of their dedication to the Church and to their vocations. When I was researching my book, I attended the IRL meetings to get a sense of what was going on in religious communities. And at the IRL, I met several religious who were in communities that were and still are deconstructing themselves. Those religious came to the IRL and still come here for this very nourishing environment. Many of these religious very generously share their stories with me, and still other religious have written me after my book was published. I've heard their stories about being forced out of lifelong apostolates and ostracized from community, about being subjected to feminist liturgies and having their chapels stripped of religious imagery, about being belittled for wearing the habit and scolded for wanting to attend daily Mass, about being isolated in secular nursing homes and silenced for daring to disagree with leaders who are intent on remaking religious life and even the Catholic Church itself. And still, these religious remain dedicated to their vows, faithful to the Church, and loyal to their beloved communities. Surely they are among the glowingly positive signs for religious life. And even if their orders do not survive, the witness of these holy people will endure and continue to inspire us. Other positive signs are those religious orders that have faithfully followed church teaching on religious life, but still face an uncertain future because they are unable to attract new members. Most religious orders have suffered an image problem because of the public dissent of some prominent women and men religious, and because so many religious orders seem to be in a state of chaos. Unfortunately, even those orders that are doing everything right suffer from this image. And it's a sad fact that some of them probably will not survive. However, these religious can take heart in the fact that they have been faithful and they have laid the groundwork for religious life not only to survive, but indeed to flourish through other orders that are receiving new members. So as I bring all these ideas to a conclusion, I want to look finally at what can be done by religious, the church, and laity working together to enhance and strengthen religious life and help pave the way to that important crossroads of success. These are just some ideas I've developed as a longtime lay journalist in the Catholic press, and perhaps the panel will be able to weigh in with some more ideas. My ideas apply to apostolic religious orders. So what can religious do? First, acknowledge that it is human to make mistakes, and that attempting to renew religious life, many orders made very serious mistakes. So look at what has gone wrong and try to figure out why and what to do about it. It seems evident from the information I have presented that the most successful and joyous religious institutes are those that have studied church guidelines on religious life and have followed them. In fact, every religious order, no matter how good the shape it's in, would do well to continue to study church guidelines and use them to evaluate their practices. 2, exercise a corporate apostolate, whatever it may be, in communion with the church and in the name of the church. And if that apostolate is exercised in a visible way, religious will evangelize and proclaim by example, and people will know who they are, what they stand for, what they do, and some people will be inspired to join them. In short, religious should be the ecclesial people they represent themselves to be. 3, live and pray in community and reflect joy and satisfaction with this way of life. Young people who feel a call to religious life want to be members of a joyful and supportive community. They do not seek to join religious orders whose members are angry with the church and want to do battle with the hierarchy. 4, invite young people to share this joy and way of life and plan with them for a bright future. A vocation study by Georgetown's Carey found that the most important factor in young people choosing a vocation was the example of a priest or religious coupled with a personal invitation to join them in their vocation. What can the church do? 1, the church must support religious who want to live according to church definition of religious life and guarantee their canonical rights. This may have to include apostolic visitations to a multitude of orders. But again, this is a matter of justice. And it would be a sign that the church values dedicated men and women religious and is serious about the standards it sets. 2, bishops must exercise the authority granted them by canon law over the liturgy and the apostolates of religious orders within their diocese. I can get away with saying this stuff because I'm laity. 3, the church must secure ecclesial properties so that religious institutes have the material means to survive and a location for exercising their apostolates. Greater oversight must be exercised to prevent ecclesial properties from being turned over to secular entities or sold at below market value. 4, the church must insist on financial accountability from religious orders so that the order's patrimony is wisely managed and elderly members of the order are well cared for. 5, the church must assure that mergers and amalgamations and unions are in the best interests of the orders involved and guarantee that all members have voice in such decisions. I've heard unsettling stories lately about mergers being forced on members of religious orders who feel they have no say in the matter and are told if they do not approve of the merger, they can find another order to accept them or they can depart religious life. These are hardly viable alternatives for elderly religious. 6, church authorities must insist that religious conduct themselves as religious or else depart religious life. The scandal given by people who claim to be religious, but who reject church authority and teaching, is extremely damaging to religious life and to the church. Moreover, the presence of these people in religious orders, and sometimes even in leadership positions, is an injustice to the other members of the order who want to live authentic religious life. And it is a scandal to the laity who look to religious as role models in the church. And finally, what can laity do? 1, families need to welcome babies as a precious gift, not as a financial burden. 2, parents need to set aside unrealistic fears based on decades-old practices. Parents need not fear that their child might be recruited by a religious order as a young teenager, or that the family would rarely see a child who became religious. 3, laity need to speak positively about men and women religious and emphasize the intrinsic value of dedicating one's life to God and to the work of the church. 4, laity need to speak positively about men and women religious and emphasize the intrinsic value of dedicating one's life to God and to the work of the church. 5, laity need to encourage children to consider a vocation to the religious life as a desirable and laudable life choice. Carey's vocation study found that that half of the parents' questions never encouraged their children to consider a vocation to the religious life or the priesthood. As a parent and a grandparent, I would guess that that figure really is more than half, just from hearing my friends talk. We need to make clear to our children that not every good Catholic is called to religious life, but if a person is called, it is a special privilege. Parents also need to consider the needs and expectations of our children, not our own expectations that our children will provide us with grandchildren or follow in our professional footsteps. And 6, parents should make God an integral part of home life and accompany their children to Mass and other religious services. I'm going to stop now and give the panel a chance for some input on my conclusion that religious life is both in crisis and at a crossroads. Let me just emphasize that I believe decisions made by religious and by church authorities in the next 10 years will be crucial in getting religious life out of crisis and onto the right crossroad. If religious orders turn away from the church and become focused on secular models and sociological principles, they will go down the road of irrelevance and obscurity. But if religious life is lived according to church principles and the charisms of the order's founders, it will turn up the road of relevance and light and shine, as Pope John Paul said in Vita Consecrata, like a treasure at the heart of the church. Thank you.